When Curtis Yarvin coined the phrase Dark Enlightenment, he thought he was being clever. He thought he was dressing up authoritarianism in philosophical garb, giving oligarchy a new vocabulary so that the most ancient form of hierarchy could masquerade as innovation. But the truth is simpler than his language lets on. Strip away the branding, and what remains isn't an intellectual breakthrough. It's regression. It's not a dark enlightenment. It's the Endarkenment, a deliberate attempt to roll back the very principles that gave humanity its first glimpse of liberty, dignity, and reason. The Enlightenment was never perfect, but it was profound. It shattered the idea that kings ruled by divine right, that priests held the keys to knowledge, that people were born as masters and slaves. Thinkers like Locke, Paine, and Rousseau argued that authority derives not from bloodlines or heavens, but from consent and reason. Science emerged as the method to test truth, not accept it on decree. Democracy began to take root, however flawed its first attempts. And in that fragile birth, humanity learned that liberty is not a gift. It is a structure, a system, something we can design and defend. The Endarkenment seeks to reverse that progress. Yarvin and his followers argue that democracy has failed, that people cannot govern themselves, that society must return to hierarchy where the few rule over the many. He takes the very vocabulary of the Enlightenment and twists it into its opposite, as though branding the collapse of liberty as dark wisdom could make tyranny sound like philosophy. But there is nothing new here. It is the same fatalism that emperors whispered, the same resignation that aristocrats sold, the same contempt for the people that oligarchs have always wielded. His so-called Dark Enlightenment is nothing but a smokescreen for a very old lie, that humans need masters. This is where Enlightenment socialism draws its line. We don't accept that liberty must be temporary or that freedom is destined to collapse into domination. We argue the opposite, that domination is a failure of design, not a law of nature. If oligarchs can hoard power, it is because institutions allowed them to. If people can be reduced to subjects, it is because systems were built to strip them of self-determination. The lesson of the Enlightenment is that structures matter, and the lesson of socialism is that liberty without material security is a mirage. Without housing, food, time, and dignity guaranteed, the vote is hollow. Without abundance, freedom is always provisional. Enlightenment socialism insists we finish what the Enlightenment began, building systems where liberty is not fragile, not conditional, but permanent. Look closely at the world Yarvin imagines. It is a return to monarchy, updated with the rhetoric of efficiency and order. He imagines CEOs as kings, corporations as kingdoms, and citizens as subjects. He speaks of exit and patchwork as if choice can exist in a world where survival depends on submission to private rulers. But peel back the rhetoric, and it's feudalism with better branding. It's the same justification oligarchs have always given, that the people are too unruly, too ignorant, too unfit to govern themselves. And behind that contempt lies fear, because if ordinary people realize that liberty can be designed into the structure of life, the oligarch has no role left to play. This is why I call it the Endarkenment. Not because it is bold or radical, but because it drags us backwards. It seeks to end the project of enlightenment before it is completed. The Enlightenment declared that reason, liberty, and equality were possible. The Endarkenment says they were mistakes. The Enlightenment opened the horizon of human dignity. The Endarkenment tries to close it, to convince us that hierarchy is inevitable, that oligarchy is our fate, that scarcity and submission are permanent features of existence. But there is no inevitability here. Scarcity is not natural. It is manufactured. Tyranny is not destiny. It is engineered. History's boot has pressed down again and again, not because freedom is impossible, but because freedom was never structurally secured. We let markets dictate survival. We let rulers hold monopoly over the commons. We let oligarchs hoard technologies that could have liberated humanity and turned them instead into weapons of control. The Endarkenment tells us this cycle is eternal. Enlightenment socialism says the cycle ends when we design systems where liberty is the natural output. That is why housing must be sovereign, why automation must liberate time, why resources beyond Earth must be claimed for humanity as a whole and not for a priesthood of billionaires. These are not utopian gestures. They are the infrastructure of liberty. Yarvin argues for hierarchy because he cannot imagine freedom scaling to billions. We argue that if freedom cannot scale, then it is not freedom at all. It is a reprieve between masters. True liberty is not the absence of domination for a moment. It is the permanent obsolescence of domination itself. The Endarkenment wants to convince you that democracy has failed, but democracy did not fail. It was sabotaged. The Enlightenment was never fully realized. Women were excluded. Slaves were counted as property. The poor were denied the vote. And still, even in that incomplete state, the idea of liberty spread like fire, terrifying kings and oligarchs alike. The task before us is not to accept Yarvin's regression, but to finish the unfinished revolution, to take enlightenment seriously enough that it extends to everyone in practice and in permanence. History will not remember the Endarkenment as philosophy. It will remember it as propaganda for oligarchs who feared equality. It will remember it as the last gasp of aristocratic thinking wrapped in digital jargon, trying to convince a wounded generation that liberty was too much to ask for. And history will remember those who refused that lie, those who said no, liberty is not provisional, no, scarcity is not destiny, no, hierarchy is not inevitable.